Hey everyone, I'm Jordan Larsen,
And I'm Zach Larsen.
and together we own and operate Togiak River Lodge, located just a few miles from Bristol Bay and the village of Togiak.
Our kingfishery on the Togiak usually takes off between the 15th to the 21st of June and is generally winding down by the 26th of July. Because of the large numbers of returning king salmon and their extremely aggressive nature, anglers are not generally limited in the ways in which they pursue these fish. A wide array of tactics work, and work well. With that being said, we have two go-to methods that we want to share with you today. These are methods that you can employ anywhere there are decent numbers of king salmon, not just on the Togiak. Our first and arguably favorite method to target Togiak kings is the classic inline float setup. Traditionally fished in slow or swirly currents and back eddies, this is an extremely effective method that is guaranteed to bring out the inner 4-year-old in anglers of any age. Traditionally, a large bait of cured salmon roe, either in sack or skein, would be the bait of choice, and while extremely effective, kings fresh out of the salt have a tendency to take the baits deep. We're practicing catch and release, a quick hook set, or artificial egg patterns are often required. Regardless, rigging is the same. Let's check it out. The rigging we have in front of us is the setup that we use 90% of the time when we're float fishing for kings on the Togiak. Now before we get into the setup of this, let's talk about rods, reels, and line. Generally speaking, when you're float fishing specifically, I'm looking for a rod that is 9 foot long at a minimum, 9 to 11 feet long. You can certainly go longer. There's some custom rods that are 12, 13, 14 feet long. A lot of times they're unnecessary. A 9-foot rod, if you had to buy a do-it-all rod, would definitely take care of what we're trying to accomplish here. So 9 foot plus, we're looking for a rod that's probably a medium-heavy rating at the lightest. The rods that we're using at the lodge are a 9-foot Shimano Scimitar. They're rated 10 to 30 pound test. I believe they're medium heavy. So you're looking with something, a fair amount of backbone. Now as far as the reel goes, whether it's a spinning reel or a bait casting reel, you're looking for something that's going to hold somewhere between 150 to 200 yards of a fairly heavy braided main line. The fish that we're fighting on the Togiak are big fish. The adults are probably 15 to 30 pounds on average, and they can go on some just crazy long runs. So that line capacity is a good thing to have. As far as the line that we're running, generally on our float fishing outfits, we're running at least 50-pound test, sometimes 65-pound test braid. In this case, it's Power Pro braided line. Any of the major manufacturers of braided line are good enough, though I wouldn't get too hung up on brand. As far as the actual rigging goes, we start with a thread bobber stop tied onto the main line. Now this is going to control your depth. The float slides up and down on the line, and if everything works right, it's going to slide up against that stop, and it'll stop there. So you're going to set that stop to the depth that you're trying to target. Below the bobber stop, we have what's called the bobber stop bead. Now most of your floats that you can buy commercially are going to come with a bead just for this purpose. The most important thing to know is that they have a real small diameter hole in the middle of them. Specifically so that they don't go up and over the stop, and so that the bobber stops where it's supposed to. Below the bead obviously is the float. In this case it's a 1 ounce arrow float. For 99% of the king fishing that we do in the Togiak, you can use a 1 ounce float. It's kind of the universal go-to up there. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be the universal go-to for you. Generally what I like to tell people is use the smallest float that you can that will allow you to get your presentation to where the fish are at. So if you can drop down to a 1/2 ounce rated float and a little bit smaller inline sinker and still get your gear into the zone, you're probably going to get more bites. The less physical presence you have in the water next to the fish, I think is probably better. Now that being said, kings are not generally gear shy or leader shy. So there's some advantages to running a little bit heavier of a float. You can certainly cast this float setup a little farther than a lighter one, especially with the heavier line. So it's a give and take. Like most things in life, you're looking for a happy medium, and this is one that works well for us. Now below the float, I think, like I already mentioned, we've got a 1 ounce inline sinker there. You can use a variety of styles of inline sinkers. I personally like the ones with the swivels just because they allow everything to move and to flex and to give. It cuts down on line twist, but it's certainly not a must-have. Below the inline sinker, we go to our leader. Now this leader is substantially shorter than what a lot of folks will run. We're blessed by extremely aggressive fish on the Togiak, and a lot of times you can get away with a real short leader like that. That leader's probably in the range of 15 to 18 inches long. And that would be the shortest that we would run. It's real common to run a leader up to 2.5, maybe even 3 feet long. There's some individuals that like to run a longer leader, especially in clear water, and that's fine. The thing to consider is that your bait will then be able to rotate however far around your weight, as long as the leader is, right? So if you got a 4-foot long leader, your bait can be within an 8-foot zone, which can be a disadvantage, right? You want to keep that bait in the zone as close to the fish as is possible. Now you can see on both these leaders that I have here, both the bait setup and the bead setup, that I've got a couple split shot. Now on a leader this short, you really don't need the split shot. But on a longer leader, let's say you're approaching that 4-foot length, this becomes extremely beneficial to have, as it helps to keep that bait in the zone. It helps it sink faster, and it keeps it from swinging as violently if you're in real swirly or turbulent water. The hook that we're running is a 3/0 octopus style hook. I'd say 3/0 or 4/0 for most general purpose king salmon fishing is all that you need. There are a lot of guys that run larger hooks, 5 or even 6/0, and they certainly catch a lot of fish. I don't know that they're necessary though, and a little bit smaller hook drives home a lot easier into the fish's mouth if you got somebody who just isn't able to set the hook real hard, or maybe you don't catch quite up to the fish before you set the hook. A little bit smaller, finer hook lends itself well to that. And again, it's a happy medium, and there's just a lot of preference there. As far as the application of bait on this is the traditional setup that you would run with cured salmon roe, whether in a bait sack or in the skein. To apply that, you're just going to push the line back through the eye of the hook to give yourself a loop, just like this. You're going to take your bait, whatever it is, slide the middle of the hook, or slide the hook right through the middle of the bait, put your loop around the bait, and cinch it down nice and snug. You don't want to pull too tight because it'll cut the bait in half and you'll lose a lot of it. Now, one thing to consider, it's not the cleanest way that you've ever fished. There's going to be a lot of mess and a lot of goo all over. Just kind of comes with the territory. Definitely wear gloves. It just makes cleanup way easier. And I'd say make sure that you have a good fresh bait on there at all times. Cured roe can be a commodity. It can be expensive. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to get, and so guys, they want to be real conservative in how they use their bait, and I get it. But at the end of the day, a good fresh bait is going to get bit way more often than an old washed out bait. It's worth every 3 to 5 casts at least putting a little bit more bait on, if not replacing it completely. Moving on to the bead setup. The primary advantage to the bead is, well, it doesn't come off very easy. You're always fishing, you've always got a presentation there. The other distinct advantage for us, where we're at on the Togiak, we're real near tidewater most of the time. The fish are generally fresh, they're generally way aggressive, especially when it comes to eggs. And a lot of times they'll be deep hooked, right? If you don't swing on them as soon as that bobber goes into the water, they end up hooked into the gills, and if you're not looking to keep that fish, or if you're out practicing catch and release, it's not real conducive to that. That's where the beads shine. They rarely, if ever, take the beads very deep. And they bite them most days, I'd say just about as well as eggs. There's some days where the eggs definitely outshine, but for what we're doing up there, these work fantastic. The other primary advantage is that they just don't come off. If you've got anglers on board who can't cast real well or just haven't practiced a whole lot, this is something they can utilize. They can mess up, they can slap the water in the front of the boat, and their bait's still good. They're still going to be fishing. So really it comes down to preference. The last couple years, we've gotten to where we've run beads probably 60% of the time when we're float fishing for king, 60 to 75% of the time, because they just lend themselves well to good conservation practices, and they're easy to fish. This specifically is a 20 millimeter soft bead from B&R Tackle. The color on this is sweet pink cherry, and we utilize a lot of these on the Togiak. We use a lot of the sweet pink cherry, a lot of the mottled red, and a lot of the clown colorations. Every system's a little bit different though, so play around with colors. The other thing is, don't get scared by running too large of a bead. This is the smallest bead that we run for kings on the Togiak. Most of the fishing that I do personally, I like to run the 25 millimeter beads. They're a little more present. The fish can see them from farther away. But we'll even run the next size up, which is a 32 millimeter bead. It is giant and it looks silly, but it works well. especially in place of big baits of eggs. It's just way cleaner. So there's a couple different options for you guys. With all that being said, let's take a look at how we put these into use on the Togiak.
Toss out. Where you at? Toss out. Stop right. Yep. Go ahead right out. Come back just a little bit. Lift. Lift. Drop it.
The second method we will cover is the most widely utilized method for king salmon, back trolling. Specifically in this case, back trolling large salmon plugs such as the Yakima Bait Company Maglip and Hognose Flatfish, the Lure Jensen Quickfish, or the classic Warden's Lures Flatfish. Generally fished 40 to 60 feet behind the boat, these lures are backed downriver slowly through long, fishy runs. Ease of operation and very little input on behalf of the angler allow for anglers of all ages and skill sets to successfully target the largest of the king salmon. It is common for our largest fish each year to come on a back-trolled plug.
For sure.
Pretty big one.
The second method that we'll be going over in depth today is back trolling. Specifically, back trolling large plugs like this Yakima Bait Company 5.0 Maglip. Now, back trolling in its simplest form is basically just backing a presentation really slowly down the river. The idea being that the fish are downstream of the boat, maybe 40, 50, 60 feet behind the boat, and you're going to hang something in their face until they get aggravated enough to bite. Now, the primary advantage to plugs like this one is that the fish don't generally take them very deep. You can practice catch and release without really truly harming the fish. You can back troll with bait behind a diver in the same exact way. The problem though is it's a straight on shot for the fish, and a lot of times they'll take it very deep. Now the rigging for these is extraordinarily simple. I've got two different options set up in front of us. My preferred option personally is to run my leader tied directly into the main line, as you can see here. Now the main line in this case is a 65-pound test braid to a 50-pound test leader. We generally run fairly heavy leader on the Togiak. It aids in releasing large numbers of smaller fish at the boat without netting them. Generally speaking, in Washington, Oregon, California, I would say probably start somewhere with 20 to 25-pound test leader material, depending on where you're at. Again, clear water, as we talked about before with the float setups, you're going to want to run a little bit lighter leader. Murky water, you can run a bit heavier leader. Generally speaking, king salmon and king salmon specifically that are fresh in out of the salt water are not leader shy at all. I know guys that run 80-pound braid directly to their plugs and they catch fish all day long. For me, I'm a little bit more confident having a leader, and it's easier to grab at the boat to release fish as well. It doesn't cut you quite as bad. So that's the first rigging. This is a line-to-line connection. In this case, it's an RP knot, but a double uni knot or an Albright knot or an FG knot, those are all viable options. For the sake of time, we're not going to go over how to tie those here. You can find a whole host of videos online that go over those in depth, all of which are pretty easy to tie. The other rigging that we have is a more conventional setup with a chain swivel in between the leader and the main line. In this case, it's a 4-chain swivel. And the reason for doing this, the primary advantage, is that in rivers that have a lot of vegetative debris coming downstream, the weeds and the grass can get hung up on the plug and they'll affect the action. If you have something just as simple as a chain swivel 4 or 5 feet up from the plug, it'll catch most of that debris before it can get tangled around the plug and adversely affect the action. Now, as far as plugs go, like I mentioned, this is a 5-inch mag lip from Yakima Bait Company, and as you can tell, it's caught a couple fish. This one's pretty hammered. Other viable options are the hognose flatfish, also from Yakima Bait Company. You've got the classic Warden's Lures flatfish, again, now owned by Yakima Bait Company. And then you've got the Lure Jensen Quickfish series of plugs, which are very similar. All of those plugs catch fish. I wouldn't overthink picking one or the other. We've run a lot of these mag lips and a lot of the hognose flatfish because they're very versatile, and they'll pull in really slow water and they'll pull in really heavy water. The Quickfish and the old school flatfish are a little more sensitive to current flow. If you get too much current, it overworks them and they don't pull the right way. You can pull these mag lips in some water that is just ripping fast, and they're just versatile. That's why we use them, and they work well. As far as the hook setup goes, whether you're running an old school flatfish or a Lure Jensen Quickfish or one of the newer mag lips or hognose from Yakima Bait Company, I like to rig the hooks on them in the same way regardless of the plug. You can see here that I've removed the belly hook, but I've left the split ring on. I feel that a little bit of extra weight in the middle of the plug helps keep that plug balanced, and it helps it in heavier water. The more weight you remove from the center of the plug, the more radical it's going to get, the more radical its action is going to be. And that can be good, that can be advantageous. The problem though is that at a certain point it spins out and it just doesn't work the right way. The other advantage of having that split ring on there is it's just a little more weight. It helps it get down just a little bit more. You can run them with or without. There's a lot of guys that take the split rings off. They catch a ton of fish. This is just something that has worked for me personally. As far as the hook on the back goes, you can see that I've got a split ring to a barrel swivel, then to a single Siwash hook. Now there's a number of varieties of single Siwash hooks that will work here. In this case, this is just a standard J-bend open eye Siwash from Gamakatsu. This is a 3/0 hook. This is a number 7 barrel swivel. For most purposes, a number 5 is probably going to be better. This is a completely stainless steel swivel with a super high break strength. This is something that I was playing with. I didn't want too much weight on the back that you might associate with the next size up. I would say for plugs bigger than this on the hognose and especially on the K16, you can run a number 5 swivel. It's not too much weight. It doesn't affect the action, and it gives you a little bit more strength. I've had these fail, so just as a precautionary, you might go to the next size up. Again, this is a number 7, so go to a number 5. And that's a 3/0 single hook. Now, there are other options for single hooks. Owner and Mustad both make a similar hook in a similar style. The sizing is pretty similar as well. Gamakatsu makes a single hook that's called a 510 Siwash or a 510 spoon hook. It's a much shorter shank and a much wider bend, and the barb is actually on the outside of the hook. Those are a viable option. I've used those with great success. They are a bit more expensive. And for me, I don't know that the price is worth I don't know that it's worth the performance that you get. They're a great hook if you don't mind spending the money. Certainly run them. But that is a setup that works very well. I find that fish are almost always hooked right in the corner of the mouth, on one side of the next. Very rarely do you hook them deep. And the hook to land ratio, most days I feel is better with the single Siwash as opposed to a treble hook out the back or even the dual trebles that they come with from the factory. Now, I'm not a fan of running a single Siwash off the belly hook. I find that they get snagged up a lot easier. A lot of times I'm kind of pushing the limits anyway. If you can get these in real close to structures in the water, whether they're rocks or logs, big boulders, what have you, the fish oftentimes are taking advantage of that current seam associated with that structure. And when you've got a belly hook hanging off, they're just more apt to get hung up. Also for us, especially on the Togiak, with the number of fish that we're releasing on a daily basis, it's a lot easier if you've just got one hook to deal with. You run the heavy leader, you can wrap your hand around it, you can slide your dehooker over that single hook, pop it right out, and you're good to go. So that's how I would rig them. Now, I have seen guys rig just a single hook off the belly of the plug. I've ran them that way, and I'm just not confident in them. There's guys that have caught lots of fish and big fish that way. For me, it's a confidence issue. I just much prefer having the plug rigged with a tail hook. So that's the basic rigging. Like I said, it doesn't matter the brand of the plug. Whether it's a quick fish or a flat fish or a hognose flatfish, you can rig them that same identical way. What we'll get into next is how to enhance these with a little bit of scent and a little bit of smell. Now what a lot of guys are familiar with is a plug that has been wrapped with either a chunk of sardine or a chunk of anchovy or sometimes even a chunk of herring, but a chunk of salt-cured sardine is the most common. Now where we're at on the Togiak, we're really remote. It's difficult to get sardines out there, or any other fresh or frozen bait for that matter. So what we have here is a mixture of canned tuna, believe it or not, and minced up cured salmon roe. I know a lot of guys will kind of roll their eyes at this and go, what the heck is he talking about? This is something that we have used a lot on the Togiak, and it is extremely effective. The fish up there really key in to the scent of salmon eggs. We catch fish on straight tuna wraps, a lot of fish, but I truly believe they work better with a little bit of eggs added in. Now these are just cured salmon eggs like you would fish under a float. I take them and mince them up with a pair of scissors right into the tuna, mix them in as good as you can, and now we're actually going to wrap those, or wrap this mixture onto the plug much the same way that we would a sardine wrap. Now granted, this is a little bit messier because, well, canned tuna fish often is in chunk form. It's not a solid piece of fish, so you're going to have to wrap a little bit more extensively than you would otherwise. So what we're going to do, we're going to take about a spoonful, about like that, to wrap on there. And I'm actually going to turn this plug around. So I'm going to take and center this tuna and egg mixture right in the middle of the plug there. Like I said, this is a messy affair. If you're going to be doing this all day, definitely gloves are not a bad idea, and bring some rags and stuff to clean up with. I forgot to mention before I get going here, any tuna will work, but I definitely prefer tuna packed in oil. I feel like it disperses the scent a lot better, and we seem to get bit more. Kings are notorious for being scent sensitive. You know, they have certain flavors, if you will, that they really like, and they can often be very stimulated by something that has a very strong, intense scent. So something to keep in mind. This isn't the be-all, end-all by any stretch, and the sky's the limit for what you want to play around with. You could take canned tuna and add in all manner of other scents that you've had good success with, and I'm positive that you're going to catch fish on them. For us on the Togiak, though, like I said, this is something that we can get very easily. It stores for a long time. We don't have to worry so much about spoilage, and it works very well. So we've got our spread, if you will, our tuna spread on the plug. I'm going to begin by wrapping, and I'm using Atlas Mike's Miracle thread. It's just a real thin elastic thread. There's a number of comparable threads in the market. I wouldn't get too hung up on what you have access to. But we're going to start with some fairly loose wraps, kind of spiraling back down to the bottom of the plug, and then we'll change our direction and we'll wrap loosely again up towards the bill of the plug, just like that. And each time we go down the length of the plug, we're going to wrap incrementally tighter. Basically, we're building a web to keep all of those loose little pieces trapped inside. And you're going to go through a fair amount more of the thread than you would if you were just wrapping on a fillet of sardine or anchovy or herring. So now we're getting fairly tight. You can see some of the juices starting to come out of that wrap. And I'm just going to continue to really wrap that thing up well. Get to the bottom, we're going to go once more up to the top. Come back to the middle. Now you'll see guys finish these wraps in any number of ways. For me, I'll stick my index and my middle finger out on my left hand. I'll go around that 3 or 4 times, pull it back, cut the line, and now I'm going to take that tag end and slip it right through there just like that. I'm going to cinch it down and pull it until it snaps just like that. And now we're going to take and make sure that wrap is lined up and nice and centered on the plug. And you can see that they'll get a little bit off kilter. If you have it leaning off to one side or the next, it'll affect the way the plug swims. So just center it the best you can by eye, and then you're going to give it a test swim in the water. You're going to pull it real hard in the current. If it was tuned in the first place, it should swim true. And then if it doesn't after your wrap, then you're just going to adjust your wrap, right or left. These plugs are really forgiving. The mag lips of all of them out of the box generally swim the most true. The quick fish are great plugs, but you usually have to spend some time tuning on the eyelet to get them to swim straight. But if you've got that wrap centered up like that, usually, I mean probably 95% of the time, these plugs will swim true as soon as you put them down. And that's the long and the short of it. You can fish that wrap, probably a good 2 or 3 hours. A lot of times I lose confidence that there's enough scent there. You know, sometimes I'll feel like there's fish and we're just not getting them to go. And I'll bring them in and I'll cut the wrap off and I'll throw it in the water, and you can just see the scent trail and the oils come out of it. These really hold their scent very well. Surprisingly so for being composed of super small pieces of fish and salmon eggs. But that's the rig that we run on the Togiak. This is something that we run. When we're running plugs, we're probably running that 95% of the time. Sardines work great. Anchovies and herring also work well. But if you're in a place where you don't have reliable access to fresh bait like that or frozen bait, this is something that can really, really make a difference. With all that being said, let's take a look at how this works on the Togiak. So I got it. Think that's a keeper, or do you want to go for something bigger?
How big do you think that is, 20?
I think he's right about that 20-pound mark, yeah. Good fish, not the biggest fish we've seen, but I mean, be a good eating fish.
What do you think, Dad?
It's up to you, man. What do you think?
Yeah, we'll let him go.
Let him go? Okay.
It's still early in the day.
It is, very much so. No, he hasn't found any trees yet either.
Coming right in here.
Yeah.
Bigger than your feather? I can't see yet. It's about the same size.
I think for all practical purposes, they're twins. Right about the same. Not fighting nearly as hard as I expected. It's not yet. No, maybe I was wrong. Right fish though. Are we kicking this one back? Okay.
We hope this presentation on Togiak kingfishing was useful and informative. For more information on fishing the amazing Togiak River, visit us at togiaklodge.com.